During the past decade, there have been many major scandals involving doctors who have molested both male and female patients at colleges and universities. At the University of Southern California, Dr. Tyndall; at UCLA, Dr. Heaps; at the University of Michigan, Dr. Anderson; and at Ohio State University, Dr. Strauss. There are also major cases ongoing that involve doctors who have molested hundreds of children in clinics in Oregon, Dr. David Brian Farley, and in Pennsylvania, Dr. Johnny Bardo. The Roman Catholic Church, the military, the Boy Scouts, colleges, and universities, they all have withered under the spotlight of sexual misconduct scandals and promised that abuse will no longer be swept under the carpet. The medical profession, however, has never taken on sexual misconduct as a significant priority, and layer upon layer of secrecy makes it nearly impossible for the public or even the medical community itself to know the extent of physician sexual abuse. In a national investigation, the Justice in America network TV series staff examined documents that describe disturbing acts of physician sexual abuse in every state. Rapes by OB/GYNs, seductions by psychiatrists, fondling by anesthesiologists and ophthalmologists, and molestations by pediatricians and radiologists. Some doctors were disciplined over a single episode of sexual misconduct. A few physicians with hundreds of victims are among the nation's worst sex offenders. But the toll can't be measured by numbers alone. For patients, the violations can be life-altering. The betrayal even pushed some to suicide. How do doctors get away with exploiting patients for years? Because some victims say nothing. Intimidated, confused, or embarrassed, they fear that no one will take their word over a doctor's. Colleagues and nurses stay silent. Hospitals and healthcare organizations brush off accusations or quietly push doctors out, the investigation found, without reporting them to police or licensing agencies. Society condemns sexual misconduct by most citizens and demands punishment. But when a physician is the perpetrator, the nation often looks the other way. Physician-dominated medical boards give offenders second chances. Prosecutors dismissed or reduced charges so doctors could keep practicing and stay off sex offender registries. Communities rallied around them. The medical profession has never taken on sexual misconduct as a significant priority. Over and over again, records show predatory physicians took advantage of a doctor's special privilege, the daily practice of asking trusting people to disrobe in a private room and permit themselves to be touched. Sexual conduct between a doctor and a patient, even if ostensibly consensual, is strictly forbidden. In ethical terms, it's a never event. In a legal sense, it can be a crime. Physicians know it's a line that can't be crossed. Its prohibition is as old as the Hippocratic Oath. Only 11 states have a law requiring medical authorities to report to police or prosecutors when they suspect a sexual crime has been committed against an adult. Secrecy is the enemy, and that enemy is at work today when it comes to abusive doctors. It takes dedicated lawyers like Manley, Stewart, and Finaldi to hold them accountable and obtain compensation for their victims. They will discuss a broken system that forgives sexually abusive doctors in every state, why a national tracking system doesn't show the extent of physician sexual misconduct, why sexual misconduct is difficult to uncover, how predatory physicians get away with their crimes, what constitutes a sexual assault, how often do medical professionals commit acts of sexual assault against patients, who is liable if you are sexually assaulted by a doctor, what you should do if you were sexually assaulted by your doctor, and other relevant and important issues. In this insider exclusive Justice in America Network TV special, Justice in America, America's Predator Doctors Crisis. Our news team is on location with John Manley, founder and partner at Manley, Stewart and Finaldi, and Morgan Stewart, partner, and Courtney Tom, as well as some of their clients, to discuss these issues. Manley, Stewart and Finaldi is the nation's leading firm representing patients sexually assaulted by doctors. They have recovered nearly $2.5 billion in compensation for patients since 2018. They have served or are serving as lead counsel in these cases. Dozens of officials at the USAG, the USOC, and MSU resigned under pressure or were fired. Some faced criminal charges, though few were convicted. The scandal led to the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse. In 2018, MSU agreed to pay $500 million to settle lawsuits accusing university leaders, including its president and athletic director, of enabling Nassar's abuse. In 2021, the USOPC and the USAG settled lawsuits brought by more than 500 athletes for $380 million. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Orange County, California. It is my great pleasure to introduce John Manley and Morgan Stewart to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve.
Tell our audience, John, and I've known you for many, many years, but tell our audience a little bit about your firm. What's your primary practice?
So our firm, Manley, Stewart and Finaldi, specializes in childhood sexual abuse and adult sexual abuse. So what we do is we represent victims and survivors of sexual abuse, ranging from small children all the way to adults who are sexually assaulted. Mm-hmm. And we've been doing that work since 1997.
Right, and you've had cases, Morgan, that span schools, churches, the Boy Scouts, the whole 9 yards, the Olympics, right? What do you find the toughest part to prosecuting these cases?
The emotional aspect. I mean, it's tangible and real to victims of, you're not just dealing with corporations, you're dealing with people's lives, and that's probably the toughest part of litigating the cases.
There are still people, John, that don't want to come forward after they've been sexually abused because they're shamed, right? How do you deal with that? How do you convince somebody that they should get justice?
I don't want to try to convince anybody to do this. What I want to do is give them their options, and if filing a lawsuit to hold their perpetrator and the institutions that enabled them accountable is part of that process, we're happy to do it. What I say to clients is, and I think the perception is by a lot of people that lawyers and clients in these cases are just chasing money. That's not what we do. And I tell our clients, look, what you want to chase is healing. A jury can smell in 2 seconds if your goal is money. For the vast majority of our clients, they want some kind of accountability and justice. And by doing that, in a way, it can be very healing. Forcing your perpetrator to sit across the table from you, or even on a Zoom, and having a lawyer ask the serious questions that need to be asked, can be very empowering and very healing. And the reality is that when this happens to you as a child or as an adult, it's essentially emotional murder. It affects you for the rest of your life. So we want to be a part of that process to bring accountability and healing, by what we do. And I think I'm proud to say we're exceptionally good at it.
How does this affect you personally? I mean, I was watching a show the other day, and somebody was in the homicide unit, and I think Dick Wolf has a new show out on Netflix talking about some of the homicides. And these homicide detectives who are tough, right? They're saying you only can do this for so long. It's a matter of how many bodies. How do you do it? How do you continue, both of you, how do you continue doing this?
It's interesting because that's the question that's often asked is it takes I think a certain personality to deal with it and being able to deal with it. I've got kids. I look at it as an opportunity to vindicate the rights of kids who were exposed to this. Last year, one of my son's teachers was arrested for placing cameras in bathrooms, and I look at that and go, we have some of those cases, and there's a certain catharsis to the process of going through this and holding people accountable. It takes a toll, but at the same time, you're doing righteous work and helping people heal.
As you both know, I've done a lot of cases, different practices, and I remember 15 years ago when we first met, I realized that to you, this is a mission. So I remember when I was interviewing the folks at the Innocence Project, and I was asking them, how much longer are you going to do this? My question to you is, you'll do it forever, won't you?
Yeah, sadly, I think Morgan and I and others in the firm all agree that we could do this forever because there's no shortage of it. And what I've discovered doing this over the last 30 years is this is a no bullshit public health problem. We have a serious problem in this country with adults abusing children. It's in institutions. And frankly, the laws and the courts haven't dealt with it appropriately. And I think a lot of if you go to prisons, if you look at homelessness, if you look at a lot of the social ills that plague this country, what you're going to find is a huge majority of those people were sexually assaulted as children.
It's a public health problem. Okay, what's the solution?
Well, I think the answer is, number one is, for example, teachers. Teachers get a background check when they're hired, and then no one looks at them again. The number of public school teachers that are being arrested for this across the country is staggering. When I started doing these cases, if you'd have told me that we have districts where we have not a few, but dozens of perpetrators in public schools, I would have been shocked. It's commonplace for people to believe that if you prove somebody abused somebody, then you win. That's not what it is. That's not the way it works. In order to show liability, also known as civil guilt, of a school district or an institution that harbors a pedophile, you have to show either negligence or they knew or should have known that this person was abusing children. In every one of these cases that we try or settle, we've proved that there was knowledge, that the institution knew and hid it.
And that's a big question I want to ask you. Proved. How? Because oftentimes complaints will be issued, correct? Mm-hmm. And somebody will have a forgetful memory. I don't remember that. Or they won't investigate it. How do you prove it?
Number one, you prove frequently the survivor themselves reports. Mm-hmm. So if the survivor reports, that's enough. But oftentimes it's the documents. I mean, you'd be stunned at how often there's a report to a principal, a vice principal, another teacher, all of whom...
All documented,
all in their documents, and they do nothing. They're all mandatory reporters under the law. So one of the other things you ask about is how can we fix this? Well, we have a DA in Los Angeles who won't prosecute these cases, or if he does, it's very difficult.
And why won't he prosecute him?
I think because he doesn't take this issue seriously. Mm-hmm. Very often our clients in Los Angeles County, not by the line DAs, but by the DA himself, are treated poorly. And they don't want to prosecute the cases unless they feel it's a dead bang winner. But moreover, I can count on one hand in 30 years the number of teachers, priests, etc., who are mandatory reporters who've been prosecuted for failing to report. I think one of the things that we did in the Nassar case, working with then Senator Feinstein, is we were able to change the law that actually President Trump signed that made it a felony under federal law for anybody in the under the Olympic program, under the U.S. Olympic Committee umbrella and all their national governing bodies. If they fail to report, it's a felony. In California, it's a misdemeanor, and there's only a 2-year statute. Well, the statute to report criminally for child abuse is much longer, so you have almost no one prosecuted. In the Catholic Church context, when the Catholic Church began to get better is when bishops started to go to jail. If administrators and teachers start to go to jail, it's going to improve. The other thing my colleague Morgan has done incredibly successfully is doggedly pursued administrators who fail to report and having their credentials removed by the state of California so they can't do it again. It's not just important for our clients to get a judgment or a win or money. It's important that their suffering have meaning by making sure that the teacher and the administrator involved never do this again to another child.
Now, we've talked about what the administrators should do. Let's talk about some of the clients that you've represented. After you settle a case, win a case, do you keep in contact? Do they keep in contact with you?
I keep in contact with clients going back 10, 15 years.
The other question is, no matter how much money someone gets, they still may be troubled. You and I have talked about this many times. You know, they may have dysfunctional relationship with other people throughout their life.
Yeah.
They may become addicts, you know, using alcohol. How do you deal with that?
What makes us different is that, you know, we're not car crash lawyers. We're not product liability lawyers. We're not business lawyers. This is all we do. The law in this area is complex, and I think largely because of some of our larger settlements, we've seen a lot of other lawyers who do all kinds of various other things and market themselves as sexual abuse lawyers. And they're free to do that. The problem with that is that, number one, you don't understand the law. Number two, you can't bring a client and go, well, what did he do to you? Did he rape you? You don't do that. This is, what happened to these people is incredibly traumatic, and you want to be very careful how you speak to them. You want them to hopefully only have to tell their story once. And you don't want this process to re-traumatize them. So, you know, we struggle very hard to make sure that the client gets the help they need both in the process and afterwards. The whole point of the money is to get them the help they need to recover their humanity. What most people don't really appreciate is, and I say it all the time, sexuality is part of our humanity. It's the way we express love. And when you take somebody's ability away to love, it's profound. And so we're very conscious of that. And this is, for us, this is not just another case. It's our vocation. It's what we do. And everybody in this firm, to a person, believes in our mission.
One of your clients is Audrey Nafziger. Let's bring her on right now. It is my great pleasure to introduce Audrey Nafziger. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
John, tell us a little bit about the case that involved Audrey.
So Audrey is a survivor of Dr. George Tyndall at USC.
And what was his official title there?
He was the staff gynecologist at the USC Health Center for over 30 years. And while Audrey was a law student, he assaulted her. What Dr. Tyndall was doing is assaulting his victims under the guise of medical care. He would act like this was normal gynecological practice, when in fact it was far from it. But many of the women were very young. Audrey was in her early 20s, and you know, sometimes it was the first time they'd ever been to a gynecologist, so they didn't know what to expect. Many of the young women were there, especially the undergraduates, for contraceptives, and they just wanted the pill. And for example, in most instances, unless there's some history of gynecological complications, nobody does a pelvic exam to give a young woman the pill, even in the 80s. And Dr. Tyndall would force these women to undergo these pelvic exams Many times he did not use gloves. Many times he engaged in unnecessary procedures that were painful. He was photographing young women naked. He would force them to strip all the way down. There were no chaperones in the room. And USC became aware of this very early on.
Because people had complained.
There were complaint after complaint after complaint, investigation, and no one did anything. And we were able to establish that, and which resulted in nearly $1 billion settlement for hundreds of women that were injured in the case. There was also, unfortunately, an accompanying class action. The clients we represented in the main action received over $1.2 million apiece on average. The women in the class action received less than $20,000 apiece. And I think what that illustrates is, number one, how some lawyers who don't understand these cases and are selfish screw them up and ultimately hurt the very survivors they're supposed to represent. But also, I think it reflects the courage of the women who stood up to USC. We were able to actually, the USC thought they were going to defeat the case on the statute of limitations because technically the statute had run. And because of Audrey and others who went up to the legislature and testified, we were able to change the statute of limitations and get a recovery for all these women.
So even though you changed the statute of limitations and the act happened before the change, it's still covered?
It's still covered. You can do that in civil cases, not criminal.
Because that's ex post facto.
I want to point out that the other thing about Audrey that's very unique is she was a sex crimes prosecutor in the Ventura County DA's office, and she's still a deputy DA there, which made her an incredible advocate. And for many of the women who did not go public, Audrey agreed to go public very early on, put herself out there, and in my view is a hero because she and several others opened the door and allowed people to hear what really happened. The way USC initially behaved was terrible. They hired Gibson, Dunn & Crutcher, one of the largest law firms in the world, had dozens of lawyers against our team.
Well, you and your team, right?
I think we had 8 lawyers at the time, and we were able to defeat them. And we were able to defeat them basically because we had women like Audrey who were willing to stand up and speak. But the great tragedy of that case is, is that Tyndall never faced justice. He was charged with multiple counts of sexual assault, and the DA's office would not push the case to trial, and he died awaiting trial after 6 years after he was charged.
What made you decide to go public early in the game?
I was going to a day of sailing with my children. They were young girls at the time with my husband. I saw the news on my phone. I saw his picture, and in that moment in time, I realized what had happened to me. I realized that USC had kept him on for almost 30 years. I realized that there were countless other survivors. And I knew in that moment, that's it. I'm going to speak out. I can't believe this has even occurred.
When you initially spoke out, who did you speak to?
So the first time I spoke publicly was on the Today Show.
I think that's right.
The Today Show. It was very early on, and I was still kind of coming to terms with everything, honestly. And I was there with, I think, 5 of us were on the Today Show. And we were interviewed, and it was scary. I mean, it was definitely scary, but my mind was set. Like, I was not gonna allow USC to get away with this, or him to get away with this. And I've seen so many sex crime survivors. I put them on the stand myself. I've walked these women, children, men through the fires of trials. I have seen the toll this has taken on people's lives, and I was gonna be damned if it was gonna happen again.
Yeah, would you say that this was a motivation for you becoming a sex crimes prosecutor?
Not necessarily. I didn't like what had happened to me, but I didn't fully understand what Tyndall had done to me at the time.
So you did not file a complaint with USC?
I was not one of the ones that complained. I got my records. I took them with me when I graduated in '92, and I carried them with me for the next 30 years because I planned on complaining, but I didn't fully understand. It was my first full-blown gynecological exam. I knew there were some problems. I didn't like him taking pictures of me and me helping him take pictures of
Yeah, I want to ask you a question, Joe. What is he doing taking pictures of?
What you have to understand about perpetrators is they're very good.
Is this a normal thing to do with a normal doctor?
No. It may be normal with a specialized camera, for example, if somebody has an abnormal pap smear to photograph their cervix, okay? But there's consent involved. There was nothing, these gynecological exams, they're called bimanual exams, aren't even generally called for women who simply want contraceptives. And what he was very good at is normalizing it. And he wouldn't give you the medication without it. So literally, for many of these women, I'm not speaking for Audrey, but for many of these women, it was either have unprotected sex, where you get pregnant, or submit to the exam, because there was no place else to go. That was your health insurance. That's where you went. I went to USC. That's where I went. I went to the very health center, and there was no other options. I mean, you're downtown LA. You know, are you going to run to, you know, one of the trauma centers that are around? You go to the USC Health Center. That's where students went. And for many years, he was the only gynecologist. So if you wanted, you know, any kind of you know, contraceptives or gynecological treatment, he was literally the only game in town. And what I can tell you about doctors who abuse their patients, they are very good at normalizing what they do. So it's abuse under the guise of medical care, and many women didn't realize what he was doing was wrong for many years. And many didn't realize it until it came out. But Dr. Tindall was a disgusting, vile pervert whose office was so filthy they had to go literally remove flies from it. He had shoeboxes full of these photographs of naked students the DA found. You know, and when your photograph is taken like that, even if it's in the 80s, you wonder, is it on the web? What's he doing with it? Is he selling it? Nobody consented to that. And like I said, USC was aware of it for many, many years and actually tried to cover it up. He was finally fired in 2016, I believe. USC paid him money. They paid him around $200,000 to go away. And the reason is they didn't want this to come out. And he threatened to sue him.
What do you have to say to all the victims out there who feel ashamed, who feel that nobody's going to believe them? What do you suggest to them?
Everyone's got to make their own, everybody has to choose their own path and how they're going to come forward. But I would say this, be courageous. Know your truth and speak your truth if you can. Find other survivors to come alongside you and to be with. Nobody wants to be alone. I mean, no survivor wants to be the first person to put their hand up. Yeah. That's from my work experience and also from this experience. It's better to be in the company of other survivors if that's possible.
One last question, John. She mentions it's find somebody else who's also been victimized. Do you share some of the clients, you know, the victims that you have? Do you have them get together so that they don't feel alone?
Sometimes. In this case, there were so many victims. And because we had the statute we had to get passed, it was necessary for survivors to meet people. We are very, very careful about protecting people's anonymity and their privacy. So I would never just willy-nilly introduce somebody, and it also has problems with the case. But in this instance, you know, there was a public trial, they met one another, and they were very supportive of each other, and I think it really did help. And you know, you had women spanning from literally age 22 all the way to almost 50. That he'd abused. So it was quite a wide range, and you know, you literally saw 30 years worth of victims who had the same stories, who never met each other, didn't know one another, and that was compelling. And yeah, I think it resulted in, you know, USC was the largest settlement against a university for sexual assault in American history. And it wouldn't have happened without Audrey and others. So obviously we're very proud of it.
One of the other questions that always pops up in my mind, you mentioned Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher, right? When someone stalls justice, you know, we're looking at USC, when somebody abuses the legal system so they don't have to pay. I would have to say, do you disagree with me when I'm going to say this, that partly that's due to the law firm, because the law firm gets paid by the hour, you know, and they're going to say to them, we're going to defend you to the best of our ability, knowing full well that's going to put money in their pockets.
I can say yes. There are, ultimately, they gave USC the right advice, but I cannot tell you the number of cases I've had where, you know, you get a bunch of Ivy League lawyers together at a big law firm that charge $1,200 an hour, and they intentionally stretch it out, knowing full well it's true. Now, they have an obligation to defend their clients, but I can tell you that's, in my opinion, unethical, but it's also bad legal strategy. The thing that's different about sexual abuse cases than other cases, like personal injury cases, is these cases almost always get better with time. And that's because perpetrators have victim after victim after victim. And when you're there that long, someone knows. So the longer they stretch it, in many ways, the worse it gets. And I'll give you an example. We would have been willing to settle Tyndall early on for much less than we did, because we didn't have any information to establish notice. We had statute of limitations problems. And then they attacked. They gave us no choice. And then we, in the military, you learn, hit the enemy where they're not. Well, the California legislature was very angry. The Me Too movement was hitting. They were very upset about the Weinstein case, and this was the perfect time to approach them. Despite USC's huge influence in Southern California, it's the largest employer in LA. We were able to get this statute passed by the legislature almost unanimously.
So time worked in your favor.
It worked in our favor. Yeah. And when I say it's bad legal strategy, I mean it. The right thing to do here for this university, and these were all, when you go to USC, they call you part of the Trojan family. I can remember my first day there. Welcome to the Trojan family. We're a family. So I said, these are your sisters, your mothers, your daughters, if we're a family. You don't treat family like this.
Right.
And what we were able to do is take that, USC, we're family, and flip it on its head and shove it down their throat, because they didn't act like family. They act like an adversary and enemy, and they owed these women justice.
Well, and you know what they gave us? They gave us depositions, which is unlike any other university case. I believe we are the only survivors that the opposition deposed, which is re-traumatizing. And I'm one of the people that they deposed. And it was wholly unnecessary to the process. It was a horrible thing.
Well, congratulations for coming forward, and also congratulations on time was in your favor.
Thank you, sir.
Fortunately, we have one of your clients with us today, Julie Wallach, so let's bring her on. It is my great pleasure to introduce Julie Wallach to the show. Welcome to the show, Julie.
Thank you, Steve.
Julie, you had the unfortunate experience of meeting a doctor by the name of Dr. Heaps, who was also the doctor at UCLA, correct?
That's right.
Tell our audience a little bit about your experience, what happened.
So I was 29 years old. I'll be 55 in August, to give some context to the timeline. And I was referred to Dr. Heaps. He was a gynecological oncologist at UCLA. I had an irregular PAP. I was sent to him. I was wanting to get pregnant within the next year. So I quickly made an appointment, went to see Dr. Heaps, and he sexually abused me. I went back a couple of times, and this is something that gets questioned a lot. Why would you ever go back if it happened the first time? How could you possibly? Trauma doesn't work that way. Experiences with, predators, oftentimes they'll talk a great game, and they're very charming. So I was told that in order for me to have a healthy pregnancy, I would need to visit him regularly. So I'm thinking about my healthy pregnancy. And I've also had come from traumatic events in my childhood and was molested. And so it was sort of, unfortunately, a familiar kind of situation. And as trauma works, it's a very distorted sort of way of thinking. I returned to him a few times. After a few times, I realized something's very wrong here. You know, I've shared this before. We go into these doctors' buildings, these offices, and then we, you know, if we're victims of abuse and we leave and have to go in the elevator with other people and go to our cars and sort of go back to living our lives. It's just such a surreal and very distorted experience.
After the third or fourth time you went to him, you realized something was wrong. What made you think something was wrong?
So a couple of things were huge red flags. He sent the nurse out of the room. So I was in the exam room alone with him.
And every time before, the nurse was in the room with you.
It wasn't that. And this is what I'm explaining about trauma, which is a big, heavy-hitting point to all of this. We can see a red flag and not know what to do about it and be frozen. So the nurse had been sent out of the room in all of the previous visits. As time went on and as my brain sort of caught up with the experiences that I was having, that's when I said, wait a minute, something's very wrong here. The nurse is leaving the room and this doctor is abusing me when I'm alone in the room with him. He caused irreparable harm to my cervix. The things that he did, I will not go into great detail about. And I can also say, even if those horrific things did not happen, he violated all of the medical ethics and also the feeling of safety and trust that I'm supposed to have in the room with a doctor. That nurse should have never left the room.
Let me ask you this question. This happened. Did you talk to other people, friends, to suddenly realize, okay, this is not right?
So, great question, and no. What I did do is I trusted my intuition, and I knew something was very off and that I needed to file a report. Now, I did go to my support, what I thought was my support system, and say to them, hey, something's wrong here. And my experience was diminished, it was minimized. I did not get the support from the people in my life at the time, so I was really on my own, seeking some kind of justice and support from the medical board, from UCLA, somebody to say, hey, let me validate your experience here, and let's get this guy not practicing medicine anymore and not abusing any more people. None of that happened.
Okay, once you realized this, you filed a complaint.
I did.
Did anything happen after that?
The medical board dismissed the report that I made.
Based on what?
They didn't give me any explanation. They just said they didn't have sufficient evidence.
Do you find this often? The same thing happened? Somebody files a complaint, it's dismissed, and they think, well, I guess this is no good for me to say anything anymore.
Yeah, I think, Steve, that does happen quite a bit. And I think this is one of the reasons survivors don't want to come forward. Who's going to believe me? Or they didn't believe me. And you know, one thing that John taught me early on was people that investigate themselves rarely find themselves guilty of anything. And so we've passed some new laws because of these cases to change how the medical board approaches complaints.
Julie, when did you finally see that Dr. Heaps was getting into trouble, that he was getting arrested at that time, or what?
So 20 years later. I do want to give a little bit of a wrap up to what happened in the late 90s. I filed my complaint away in a medical file that I had kept, and I had to sort of close this up in my own life. And I did end up getting pregnant, and I had a child, and I went on with my life to the best of my ability. A lot of therapy, a lot of working through the trauma that I'd experienced. And 20 years later, I'm scrolling through social media and I see an algorithmed ad from a law firm. Were you sexually abused by Dr. James Heaps? And I felt my insides collapse. had such relief and anguish and rage come up and through me after that. And it was Manley, Stewart, and Finaldi. So that was my first experience with this wasn't just me. And that was horrific and also a strange relief.
What do you think of the job that the law firm Manley, Stewart, and Finaldi did for you? First you.
So I am an attorney and sex crimes attorney. I think they did a tremendous job. I was careful about who I hired. They understand survivors. They build trust with survivors. They understand the law. They know what needs to be done to bring people to heal and to bring accountability. I am very pleased that I partnered with them. They brought a bunch of Nassar survivors in to meet us USC ladies, knowing there was going to be a firestorm of media, and that's a lot of pressure. And those ladies flew in from different states and sat there and basically held our hands in some of the first press conferences. And then when the Heaps case came up and I was given an opportunity to come and meet survivors and stand by them, of course, like we stand up for each other. And no one wants to be alone. It's scary to go against institutions or to speak publicly. But together we have strength, and with Manley, Stewart, Finaldi, knowing they had our backs, I knew we could get through. I knew I could get through that.
When you see that the law firm resolved these cases, was that kind of very helpful in closing the loop in all these years that you've been trying to work through things?
Well, I'll tell you, it's more than just a sort of a one question or one answer experience. You know, this was decades long. And so it was decades too late. And also, I'll say this, the first phone call I had with John Manley, he asked me if I had a therapist. And I thought, okay, are we finally getting to a place where we are merging the psychological effects of trauma and the legal system? Because that to me is, if I leave any legacy, it would be that we marry those two and do what we can. So my experience with the firm was that there was a human touch to something that can be so incredibly daunting and impersonal and victim blaming. And I had an amazing experience with the firm. And also I've had the opportunity to speak to the state Senate and Judiciary Committee to support lifting the statute of limitations for myself and all the other victims in my case. And so being a part of that was very empowering and also exhausting. And at the end of it all, it is an empowering and exhausting experience to say, I am being believed, you know, I now have a voice that I can use and it will be received in a wonderful way. And we're all seeking justice. And also that I stand in tender solidarity with all survivors, with everyone that's gone through this. And I'm not alone in that. That feels really great and again, awful that anybody else has gone through it. And there's a piece of this that's, you know, it's not ever really over. There are a lot of fires that we've got to put out. So many victims of sex crime. There's so many victims of medical sexual abuse. I'd like to be there to support people, but I'd like to not have to be.
The whole idea of the power of the doctor hiding behind their little white coat, being taught from our generation in particular, I think, being taught to be submissive to a doctor, to trust.
Automatically respectful, yeah.
And to trust them and not to ask questions. And the predator doctors, just like any other sexual predator, they know their victims, they profile their victims, and like at USC with me, someone who's never seen this doctor before, someone who's not very experienced sexually, somebody who I can do whatever I want, and this little young lady's going to listen to me, and that's how sexual predators work.
So again, I want to thank both of you for being on the show.
Thank you, Steve.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Morgan Stewart and Matthew Lehrboyd. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Morgan, you're representing some victims of a doctor right here in Orange County. Can you tell us who the doctor is and what the case is all about?
The doctor is William Thompson, a Hoag-related affiliated physician in Newport Beach, has been accused of sexual assault of hundreds of males. He was an infectious disease doctor, amongst other specialties, but affiliated with Hoag, and would use that position to sexually abuse patients who came to him.
And the case is ongoing, correct?
He is out on bail. He's currently being, I don't know what the stage of the prosecution is, because they keep adding additional charges. More and more victims keep coming forward. So he's in the process of being criminally charged and prosecuted.
When you say sexually assaulted these victims, what was he exactly doing?
He would, under the guise of medical treatment, do improper prostate treatments. He would approach them sexually. He would offer to treat them at his home. He would give them unnecessary tests under the guise of having them disrobe in front of him. And then he'd make sexual comments and sexual approaches to them.
How did this all come out in the open?
He, over the course of, I think, a number of years, there were suspicions. Ultimately, another physician came forward and reported concerns regarding his behavior. As based on our understanding, we're really very early in the process of knowing exactly what took place. Hoag is currently trying to block all discovery. So we're still trying to figure out the complete lay of the land.
Yeah, and this is the legal game that goes on.
It is the legal game that goes on.
So you request, you go to court, you demand these documents. They refuse to give it to you. Then what happens?
Well, so they've got several motions pending, a motion to stay based on his criminal history and his criminal proceedings. So they're trying to stop any discovery from taking place. We'll make motions. They're filing their motions to dismiss parts of the complaints. It's a back and forth legal process that is ongoing. But we've engaged in early discovery. They've produced some of his records, but not all of his records.
Yeah, with all of these cases, when you have hundreds of victims, they know in the end they're going to have to pay. And it isn't the hospital necessarily, it's the insurance company that has to end up paying the money, correct?
Correct, although I don't think they have enough insurance to cover the amount of claims they've got.
When you see these big awards, settlements, verdicts in these cases, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars, how is that amount of money determined?
Well, it's determined by a jury. We don't make the decision, or in terms of a settlement, it's a settlement negotiation. But the reality is, with any insurer or anybody that is paying a claim, they're going to do a risk assessment. What does that risk assessment look like? What does it look like if they're going to go to a jury? And what historically over the last 2 to 3 years has shown us is juries get these claims. They understand these claims. They emphasize with victims, and they don't like corporations and entities that cover up abuse. So verdicts are climbing. There's been verdicts in the 50 million, 100 million, 100 million plus range for single cases. When you imagine a case that has 150 victims and you have one potential case that could hit $100 million, you can see the risk, and you can see why a entity such as Hoag would say it's not worth, if we've got 150 victims and each one of those cases could hit us for $100 million, why wouldn't we settle for an amount that caps our risk?
Right, in this case, you probably so far maybe have some evidence that they were notified that Dr. Thompson had many complaints against him. They did nothing about it.
Yes.
Why is that?
It's institutional. I mean, you don't see it in just a hospital environment. As we've talked, you see it in churches, you see it in sporting organizations, you see it in schools.
They don't want the bad news to get out.
They don't want the bad news to get out. They don't want to rat on a friend. They don't want to expose a lot of entities look at it as it's not my money if something bad happens. Particularly if you look at a school or government-funded entity. It's not my money if this goes badly. So why should I do anything that's going to risk my position with it? And it's disturbing. It's worrisome if you look at it from the 1,000-foot level, and you think it's not about where the money comes from. It's about humanity and protecting somebody who is vulnerable and innocent. But we get a herd mentality with a lot of people that just can't see beyond their own sort of narrow focus of risk, and they don't want to report it.
Now, today you were very gracious to come here and talk a little bit about your case and what happened. How did you meet Dr. Thompson? Why did you go to him in the first place?
Was prescribed a medication that Dr. Thompson was familiar with by my primary care physician, and he wasn't quite familiar with it.
So you're a client of Hoag.
I was not a client of Hoag. Then my ex-partner was a good friend of Dr. Thompson's and showed me, Dr. Thompson's credentials and said, you need to go see this guy, you need to get tested before you take this medication that you were given. He knows what he's doing. And that led me to my experience with Dr. Thompson.
How many times did you visit him?
I visited him 3 times over the course of a year.
And when did you realize that this guy was a bad guy?
It didn't feel right the first 2 times, but it wasn't until the 3rd time where I went with something that to me was more of a concern than just a routine, having testing done. And it was after the 3rd time that I felt like he didn't take the reason I was there seriously, and he went into what I then pieced together was his kind of modus operandi, where he wanted to go into an exam that I didn't need, that I realized, okay, he's been using me for a chump.
Yeah. How did you realize that this exam you didn't need? What made you decide that?
So after the 3rd time, it really, metaphorically rubbed me the wrong way that he wanted to give me a rectal exam on something that I was there to talk about, an illness that I had unrelated to anything like that. So I started speaking out about what happened in my community, and someone told me that, oh no, it's not just you, he's done this, he's had complaints filed against him. I said, oh, that's exactly what happened to me. And
did you file a complaint against him at the hospital?
I did not.
You did not. So how did you end up with the law firm?
With the law firm, it was something that it was very difficult. I know how credibility works in our legal system, and I know that one voice really is not enough to take someone's freedom away. And it was a situation where I decided that, it's better that I try to move on and file it away. It wasn't until a couple of years later, I believe, that I saw on the news that they arrested him, Newport Beach police. And it was that night where I said, oh my God, they got him. Yeah. And I said, I have got to come forward and share what happened with me, because it's a kind of a now or never. Justice happens so infrequently, true justice in this country, and that I felt like I needed to.
Morgan, Matt brings up a very good point. A lot of people come forward after they see someone's arrested, don't they?
Yeah, it is, and I'm not speaking for Matt specifically, but the amount of shame and guilt, and it's a mixture, particularly when you're a vulnerable person, when you're a vulnerable minor, when you're a vulnerable patient, that mixture of shame, guilt, as you just said, you kind of bury it, you kind of wait. And a lot of it comes forward, and we see these sort of hallmarks in people's lives, when they get married or when they have the kids of their own. It's all a sort of a bundle of sort of difficulties that they have to face in their life. And the prompting of a law enforcement filing or a law enforcement announcement often prompts that courage to come forward. And it's sad that it takes that level, because that's a reflection on our society. That people who have been abused don't feel like they can necessarily speak out when it happens.
Yeah, I before I came here, I was trying to think. I'm a little bit older than you, and I was thinking, did we have this back in the 50s? Did we have this in the 60s? You did. I'm sure it took place.
It took place.
But you didn't see it in the news.
No, it didn't.
And I don't know what they did with the sexual predators at that time. I don't know whether they arrested them. I have no idea.
They moved them.
They moved them.
You look at the Catholic Church scandal, which goes back 50, 70 years, and particularly with the creation of AB 218, and where cases could be filed back and all the way back, and there are cases that exist back to the 50s and the 60s, and what you see is an acknowledgement that these things were coming forward. Yeah. But really no care for the victims, more like, oh, this is a problem. Let's move this priest or this individual to another location, and that way we'll keep it quiet. And you see that. I mean, you see that amongst the diocese.
One last question. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Yeah. It's one of those things where we were talking about that justice happens so infrequently, and I feel very fortunate that I'm seeing justice even in the form of people talking about what happened.
Yeah, and one last quick question. You mentioned earlier Marsy's Law. He's entitled to whatever documentation is being happening in the criminal case, correct?
Yes.
You get that?
I will look into that, absolutely.
At this point, they are still adding charges, so there hasn't been anything done so far.
Yeah. So I want to thank you very much for coming forward. It's very courageous of you. Thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Courtney Tom to the show. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Courtney, you have an amazing background, which brings you to this firm, right? Tell our audience a little bit about your background.
Yes, thank you. So I was with the Orange County District Attorney's Office for over a decade, predominantly during that decade's span as a prosecutor, handling some of the most heinous sex crimes cases in Orange County. I have over 50 criminal trials that range from child pornography, child molestation, up to very violent rape. So I have a lot of experience, fortunately and unfortunately, handling and walking children and women through criminal prosecution of unthinkable crimes.
And what made you decide to leave the prosecutor's office and come to private practice?
I loved being a prosecutor. I loved the work. I loved helping the voiceless. And I had seen Manley Stewart and Frinaldi help survivors who were navigating both the civil process and parallel criminal process. You see, in a number of sexual abuse cases, the path to justice is twofold. It's civil justice and criminal justice. And in California, one of our amazing laws that had been evolved over time to help victims out is Marsy's Law. And Marsy's Law is part of the California Constitution, and what that enables attorneys to do is represent survivors of crime. And John and his team of attorneys here have done amazing work in that field, that they walk survivors through the civil process, and it doesn't end there. They also walk survivors through the criminal process. And in their work in both fields, I really respected the way they did that. And at a certain point in my career, after prosecuting countless criminal cases, I decided to broaden my skill set and join the team.
When you say walk them through the civil and especially the criminal process, that means keeping them abreast of what's going on in the criminal case, right?
Absolutely. It takes the baggage that they carry day to day, that they've carried since the day they got abused, the baggage of not knowing what to do, not knowing how it's going to turn out, not knowing what to do when walking into a criminal courtroom, and you take that from them, you allow them to live their life, which they should be doing, going back to school, going back to work, and you step into that role for them and you keep them apprised of everything that's going on in the criminal case. You talk to the prosecutor and you're their voice. And pursuant to Marcy's Law, you can also address the court. You can talk to the judge as their voice when it comes to bail or plea agreements and give a voice to the voiceless.
We're here today, and you're on this show today because you're handling, along with John, 2 horrific cases, one dealing with a doctor in Oregon, Dr. Farley, and another one in Pennsylvania, Dr. Johnny Bardo. Can you tell our audience a little bit about both of these cases?
Unfortunately, sexual abuse by physicians is a nationwide problem. You know, by and large, the majority of physicians do not sexually abuse their patients. They do the work that they went to medical school, that they took the Hippocratic Oath for, to never harm a patient. Unfortunately, in these 2 cases, these 2 physicians decided not to do that from a very early stage in their careers as physicians. So when people would go to both of these physicians to cure illnesses, to make sure that they were healthy, unfortunately, both Dr. Johnny Bardo and David Farley took that very vulnerable position of their patients and used that trust, manipulated that trust for their own sexual desires. Their abuse is heinous. I think Dr. Johnny Bardo is probably one of the most prolific sexual abusers when it comes to physicians that we've seen.
And he's locked up right now, isn't he?
For the rest of his life.
Okay, so the criminal case is already over.
Yes.
Farley's isn't, correct?
Farley's is pending.
Okay, but he hasn't even been indicted, has he?
No.
I remember a long time ago when you and I talked, and I remember the priest that started, who was it, Mahoney, when he was a bishop up in Stockton, California. He had a priest, I forgot.
Father O'Grady.
And I remember when he went back to Ireland, and this is going to relate to the question I'm going to ask both of you, and he publicly came out and issued an apology, and he said, "I did it because I loved you too much." You remember him saying it?
I do.
Do you think that these doctors really believe, when you talk about the Hippocratic Oath, right? Do you believe that they are doing the right thing in their mind, or what?
No, I think Dr. Bardo is a fixed pedophile. He actually testified in his deposition. He said, "I am a pedophile." I think he knew, and he said he knew what he was doing was wrong. He simply gave in to his impulses and couldn't control himself. And, he's like a shark. Sharks consume fish, he consumes children. I always say it's up to the adults to protect children. Then there were adults in the hospital system, Conemaugh, which is now owned by a global private equity company, and Apollo Global.
They are responsible for any debt that may happen.
You know, the things he did and the people that were aware of it are all culpable for the just consumption of little boys and girls, infants. It's shocking. Farley is different in that many of his victims were young women, young adults, who were seeing him for, he was doing family care, so he'd do some gynecology, some obstetrics, and he was doing things that were just unspeakable, but again, under the guise of medical care. So both of these men were very careful how they did it, and that's what you see with physicians. It's very rare that you see a physician go up and, for example, sexually assault somebody overtly. It's always under the guise of medical care. And, we're not doctors. I'm not a doctor. I was taught as a little boy to trust doctors. We all were. And, the vast majority of doctors, my daughter is a physician. You should trust. They do amazing work. They save people's lives. But when one of their own abuses, it's a common practice for medical boards and others to turn a blind eye. Now, I will tell you, in Farley's case, the medical board took his license. He surrendered it. So while he hasn't been indicted, frankly, because of a terrible district attorney in Oregon that handled the case, he's still under investigation by the Oregon Attorney General. We're hoping, and our clients are hoping desperately, that he's indicted. Bardo pled guilty to abusing a patient and his granddaughter. It's monstrous. And but there are hundreds of doctors, all if not thousands of doctors all over this country who have administrative and criminal convictions for sexual misconduct that are practicing medicine today. California is the only state where anybody that has that conviction administratively, or in other words, by the medical board, or criminally, they have to disclose that to their patients. Most other states don't. So people are literally walking into doctors' offices all over this country
Not knowing anything.
not knowing that their doctors engage in sexual misconduct.
Yeah, you see the same thing with medical malpractice cases, and I've been reading that one of the reasons they overlook this is because there's a shortage of doctors.
Yeah.
And I even read a case where somebody who had been convicted or lost their license, for private practice, went to work for the federal government as a doctor.
Yeah.
I've seen those cases too. Where are you in the civil case against Bardo? There's a criminal conviction, so why isn't this case rushing towards settlement?
We represent over 150 women and children, and these cases take time in discovery, in revealing, leaving no stone unturned. We know how he did it,
Yeah.
but these things don't happen. This abuse by physicians doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Yeah, let me interrupt you here for a second, because you said you represent 150 people. He pled guilty to only 2 counts.
Correct.
Why
He
didn't?
pled no look.
So why doesn't the district attorney include these other cases?
It's a very small county. It's Cambria County. It's Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And he got a huge sentence. And I think there's 2 reasons. I thought the DA there did an excellent job. Yeah. It was a quick prosecution. He got 84 years. He's in his mid-70s. And I think that the feeling is there's no point, because he's already in prison for the rest.
But it would help your case, your civil case.
Yeah, but that's not, I don't need the DA to help my case. What I need the DA to do is do their job. And in that case, it's an example where the DA did an excellent job and got him arrested off the street and quickly. On the other hand, Farley is the exact opposite. We have a DA who was, and a police department who was hostile from the get-go. I think it's partially incompetence, and partially I have other, I don't want to say, because I don't want to generate a lawsuit against myself, but I believe that we're going to find some reasons that had nothing to do with law enforcement that caused this. I've never seen a DA be, essentially, our clients feel, and I feel like the DA went into the grand jury proceeding and said, essentially, let this guy go. I had zero interest from the police on prosecuting him. They've treated our clients like absolute shit, and treated them so poorly, it's really re-traumatized them.
We can't tell you how many of our clients have come to us in tears, not only about their abuse, but their treatment by the police agency, indicating when they came in to tell their story that they were met with, it's a tough case, he's a doctor. It's a tough case because he's a doctor. Yeah, I get that happened to you in that room, and that's horrible, but it's a tough case because he's a doctor. That police agency, that prosecutorial office, couldn't see past whatever reasons they had for not wanting to investigate and prosecute and look beyond that. Was it a tough case because he was a doctor in the USC case, in the UCLA case, University of Michigan, Michigan State, Nassar? No.
Yeah, let me ask you this question. I remember a case I did in Sacramento where 2 cardiac surgeons performed 698 unnecessary heart operations on senior citizens. Well, they couldn't, the civil case would have been medical malpractice caps, but they went after them for fraud. The U.S. Attorney's Office. Mm-hmm. Because the district attorney isn't doing anything, is there any way that the U.S. Attorney's Office can go after this doctor?
Well, we've done one better than that. The Oregon Attorney General's office is investigating it. We went to them. They've undertaken an investigation, and they haven't rendered a decision yet. We're very hopeful they'll indict him. And if that doesn't work, we'll go to the U.S. Attorney. David Farley, he's accused of abusing children. Now, you would think, you resign your medical license, you'd want to stay away from children. He got himself a job in an elementary school. We found out about it and alerted the authorities as a teacher's aide. or something like that.
They hired him?
They did, because he doesn't have a criminal. If you do a criminal background check, it's clean.
Okay, well, we wish you much success with this case. We'll be following it closely. And thank you very much for being on the show, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
Let me ask both of you this. You know, you get a lot of phone calls, right? You know, they read about you in the newspaper. What should victims do first if they're sexually assaulted?
The answer is report it to law enforcement. Go to
Even if they're a child, they report it to their parents.
report it to parents, go to law enforcement. I mean, almost universally, our goal as a firm should be and is the utmost criminal prosecution of any perpetrator.
So all the material that you guys collect in discovery, you obviously give it to the DA.
I can tell you,
You want them to prosecute.
We want them to prosecute.
as do the clients. We don't look for DA's help. I don't need their help to win my case. What I want to do is give them everything I have that'll help them. And the Nassar case was a really good example of that. We worked hand in glove with the State Attorney General's office. Unfortunately, Los Angeles County, it's very difficult to work with the DAs there, not because the line DAs don't want to, it's because the leadership is indifferent to the plight of victims.
I'm just astonished at that. I mean, you read about it in the newspaper, you won a lot of cases, both of you, and don't they see it?
Well, let me give you an example. George Tyndall, they arrested him, and I think he was held for 6 years without a trial. All of those victims were let down. And that's George Gascon's fault. That's the DA's fault. And they let him die. He was in custody, I think, for a week or a month, and then they gave him home arrest. And he was allowed to live his life in a luxurious apartment in LA, while these victims have to suffer with it. USC paid $1 billion to settle that case, and yet he was never held accountable. Mm-hmm. To me, that's somebody not doing their job. On the other hand, we have DAs all over the country who are awesome, mm-hmm. who want to work with us, want to get this person charged and put away. So the first thing I do when we get a call, and I think Morgan does as well, is say call law enforcement. We frequently represent clients under Marsy's Law, which is a unique statute to California and a few other states, where the client has a right to a lawyer, a private lawyer in the criminal process, and we protect them. It takes courage to do that, but it's really important. One of the reasons Harvey Weinstein got away with what he did, his lawyers were, willingly taking, $250,000 and forcing their clients to sign an NDA. He got away with it. It should have been reported to law enforcement. And our job as adults, our first job, is to stand between our children and our children in the community and those who would hurt them. That's our job, and that's law enforcement's job, and we should be doing it.
One last thing. When folks do call you, how do you determine the cases you're going to take? Because you've got everybody calling you now.
Yeah, unfortunately, we turn away a lot of cases, and we look for indicators. We look for law enforcement involvement. We look for a history. We don't always take cases that we know we can win, but we take cases that we feel strongly about, that where there's strong indications of entity involvement or entity failure. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have it all prepared to go, and we got to do discovery and we got to figure it out. But we take cases that we think are righteous and fit within the mission as a firm.
I want to thank both of you for being on the show. Keep up the good work.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.